Dr. Michael Morbius had spent most of his life chasing things that did not want to be found. Cures hidden inside diseases, answers buried inside his own blood. And now, something stranger still. For the past 6 months, hospitals across Europe had been quietly reporting cases that defied every textbook he had ever written. Patients arriving with collapsed veins and silver burns, bodies drained of color but somehow still alive. Mutations that twisted human biology into something older, something hungrier. The medical community whispered of contamination, of rogue gene therapy, of black market experiments gone wrong. Morbius suspected something else entirely, though he could not yet bring himself to say it out loud. He moved through the lower levels of an abandoned research facility outside Budapest, his coat heavy with rain, his senses sharper than any man's had a right to be. He could hear the building breathing. He could smell the rust in the pipes and the faint metallic ghost of old blood beneath the dust. Every shadow felt familiar to him now, the way a memory feels familiar before you remember it. The records had led him here. Buried inside a forgotten archive, beneath layers of falsified paperwork, he had found mentions of a project that should not have existed. Names written in Latin, symbols older than the language itself, references to creatures spoken of only in folklore, treated by these scientists not as superstition but as raw material. In the lowest chamber of the facility he found it. An artifact resting on a corroded steel table, surrounded by failed instruments and the dried remains of those who had tried to study it. It looked like a pendant carved from black glass, threaded with veins of something that pulsed faintly in the dark. Morbius approached it the way a doctor approaches a patient he already knows he cannot save. Slowly, carefully, with grief. The moment his fingertips brushed the surface, the artifact reacted. Not to him exactly, to the thing inside him. The hunger that lived beneath his skin recognized the object the way a wolf recognizes the scent of its mother. The air bent. The room folded inward. A line of crimson light split the darkness, opening like a wound across reality itself. Morbius had time only to whisper a single word before the rupture pulled him through. He woke on cold pavement, rain falling on his face, the taste of copper in his mouth. For a long moment he simply lay there, breathing. The sky above him was the same color of bruised violet he had always known. The buildings around him rose in familiar silhouettes of glass and steel. A city, then. He had arrived in a city. He almost laughed at the simplicity of it, but the laugh died in his throat, because the air smelled wrong. It smelled of predators. Not the dull, indifferent scent of human crowds, but something layered and ancient. Wet fur beneath the alleys. Old blood inside the stone. 1,000 small heartbeats moving too quickly through bodies that should not be moving at all. And underneath it, watching him, a presence so still that the shadows themselves seemed to lean forward. Morbius rose slowly. The streetlights flickered above him in patterns that felt almost deliberate, as though the city itself were taking his measure. He walked a single block before he understood that he was being followed, not by one hunter, by many. They moved across rooftops with a discipline no human body could perform. Long coats, pale faces, weapons designed for things that were not supposed to bleed. When they dropped into the street in front of him, he saw their eyes first. Cold blue lit from within. Real ones, not the experiments he had read about, not the half-formed creatures of the laboratories he had hunted. Something older, something that had been hunting long before science had given hunger a name. Their leader raised a pistol loaded with rounds that glinted silver in the rain and spoke in a language Morbius did not know, yet somehow understood. A warning, a command, a death sentence. Morbius did not move. He let them come. And when the first death dealer lunged, the living vampire let the hunger answer for him. The fight lasted only seconds. When it ended, the survivors stared at him with something close to horror. Because this stranger shared their hunger, but not their blood. Word travels quickly in a world built on shadows. Within days, the story of the stranger in the rain had spread through every coven and every den, carried by frightened scouts and trembling messengers, passed between bloodlines that had not spoken civilly in centuries. Something had entered the war, something neither side had measured. And in a world where every advantage was tracked and catalogued like currency, the unknown was the most dangerous thing of all. Morbius did not understand at first how deep the silence around him had grown. He moved through the city the way he had always moved through unfamiliar places, quietly, carefully learning. He found a derelict clock tower at the edge of the industrial district and made it something close to a home. He read the newspapers, listened to the radios, studied the maps. Slowly, the shape of this world revealed itself to him. Two great factions, locked in a war so old that no one alive remembered its beginning. Vampires above, Lycans below. Centuries of blood spilled for reasons that had long since calcified into instinct. He told himself he would not interfere. He told himself he would find a way home. But the hunger did not care what he told himself. It began with hunting parties that did not return. A coven of vampires sent to clear out a Lycan stronghold near the river vanished without a single body left behind. A Lycan tracking team that had hunted the same alleys for 40 years simply stopped reporting in. At first, each side blamed the other. Old hatreds made convenient explanations. But the bodies, when they were finally found, told a different story. The wounds were wrong. The bites did not match any known pattern. The blood loss was complete, drained with a precision that no Lycan jaw could achieve. Yet the killing strikes were too brutal, too physical for a traditional vampire. Whatever had done this killed with the efficiency of a scientist and the savagery of an animal, and it left behind no scent that any of their oldest trackers could place. In the council chambers of the vampire elders, candles burned through long nights. Theories were proposed and dismissed. A rogue immortal, a failed experiment, an assassin from a forgotten bloodline. None of the explanations fit. The Lycans, in their own deep places beneath the city, held similar councils, snarling around iron tables, demanding answers no one could give. And Morbius, alone in his clock tower, began to understand what he was becoming in their eyes. He was not a vampire as they knew the word. He had not been turned. He had not been born into any bloodline written in their oldest records. His curse had come from a syringe and a desperate man's hope, not from the bite of an ancestor or the curse of a god. When he hunted with the mind of a doctor, choosing targets the way a surgeon chooses an incision. The criminals first, the cruel one, the ones the city would not miss. He took only what he needed to survive, and he did it without ceremony, without ritual, without the centuries of tradition that both factions wrapped around their feeding like sacred cloth. To the vampires this was an insult. To the Lycans it was a mystery. To both it was a threat. Because a predator without a bloodline could not be bargained with. A predator without a tradition could not be predicted. A predator without a master could not be controlled. The whispers grew into legends within weeks. Some called him the Pale One. Some called him the Doctor. Some, in the oldest tongue, simply called him the Third. A new predator walked the night, and he belonged to neither side. And that simple fact was beginning to shift the balance of a war that had not shifted in 500 years. In the deep places of the city, older eyes began to take notice. Not the eyes of warriors or hunters, but the eyes of those who had spent centuries arranging the war like pieces on a board. They watched the rumors gather, and they understood, before anyone else did, that the board had just acquired a piece they had not placed themselves. Celine received the assignment the way she received all her assignments, without expression, without argument. The elders had spoken, and the targets they named were the targets she found. She had been a deaf dealer long enough that the work no longer required thought, only motion, only the cold and patient certainty that had kept her alive across centuries of war. But this assignment was different, and she knew it from the moment the orders were placed in her hands. The dossier was almost empty. A handful of grainy photographs, a list of locations where bodies had been found, a few lines of speculation written by analysts who clearly did not believe their own conclusions. The target had no name in their archives, no bloodline, no history. He had simply appeared, and he was killing in patterns the council could not read. She studied the photographs for a long time before she moved. There was something in the figure's posture she could not place. Predators carried themselves a certain way. She had learned to read it the way other women read faces. But this man stood like someone who was still surprised to find himself dangerous. Like a doctor who had walked into a war and discovered, to his own quiet horror, that he was good at it. She found him on a Tuesday in the rain as he was leaving a tenement building in the eastern quarter. He had just fed. She could smell it on him. But she could also smell something else. The blood on his coat was less than a man his size and his hunger would have required. He had taken only what he needed and walked away. She did not give him the courtesy of a warning. She fired 3 rounds from a rooftop and watched him move. He moved beautifully. The chase took them across half the city, through the bones of an abandoned subway line where the tunnels echoed with the sound of 2 bodies running faster than human bodies were ever meant to run. Across rain-slicked rooftops where the tiles cracked beneath their feet and the city below blurred into smears of yellow light. Through an old cathedral with broken windows where they fought briefly among the pews and the dust rose around them like incense. She had fought vampires older than nations. She had fought Lycans the size of small cars. She had fought immortals who believed themselves untouchable, and she had buried every one of them. But this man fought differently. He fought like he was trying to end the fight without ending her. Every strike he threw was a strike designed to disarm, to displace, to discourage. When he had openings, he did not take them. When she stumbled, he hesitated. When a civilian appeared in a window above the alley, he turned his body to shield her line of sight from his own claws, as though embarrassed by what he was. Celine was not a sentimental woman. Centuries had burned that capacity out of her long ago. But she was an observant one, and what she observed unsettled her more than any blow he had landed. They broke apart on a rooftop above the river, both of them bleeding, both of them breathing hard. The rain fell between them like a curtain. He looked at her with eyes that held no hatred, only a kind of weary apology, and he spoke for the first time. His voice was quiet, and his accent was wrong for this world, and the words he chose were not the words of a monster. He asked her if the people she protected knew what she was. She did not answer. He nodded as though he had expected nothing else, and he stepped backward off the roof, and the night swallowed him. Celine stood in the rain for a long time after he was gone. The orders in her coat pocket suddenly felt heavier than they had at the start of the night. She had been sent to kill a monster. She was no longer certain that was what she had found. And for the first time in a very long time, she allowed herself to wonder what else the elders had been wrong about. Their second meeting was not a fight. Celine found him in the clock tower at the edge of the industrial district, and she came alone, and she came without weapons drawn. Morbius did not seem surprised to see her. He had cleared a small space among his books and his instruments, and he gestured to a chair as though receiving a colleague, rather than a hunter who had tried to put 3 rounds through his chest a week earlier. She sat. She watched him work, and slowly, across nights that bled into one another, an uneasy partnership formed between them. She brought him samples. He asked her questions. She answered the ones she could and refused the ones she could not, and he respected the difference, which was more courtesy than she had received from any vampire in 300 years. The clock tower became a laboratory. He had improvised equipment from what he could scavenge and what she could quietly acquire, and the long wooden tables he had once used for reading were now covered in centrifuges and slides and patient rows of labeled vials. Vampire blood on one side, Lycan blood on the other. His own blood between them, the reference point, the strange middle thing that belonged to neither column. He worked with the focus of a man who had spent his life looking for cures, and what he found made his hand shake. The bloodlines were not natural. He explained it to her in the small hours of the morning, when the city outside had gone quiet and the only sound in the tower was the hum of his machines. The genetic markers in the oldest vampire samples did not show the random drift of natural mutation. They showed patterns, deliberate sequences, the kind of structural intent that only appeared in code that someone had written. The Lycan samples told the same story, different in detail, identical in principle. Someone had been shaping these bloodlines for a very long time, pruning them, selecting them, breeding them the way a farmer breeds livestock for traits he wants to keep. Celine did not speak for a long time after he finished. She had lived inside the war for 6 centuries. She had been told, since the first night of her turning, that the conflict between her people and the Lycans was a wound so ancient it could never be healed, a hatred written into their blood before any of them had been born. To hear, now, that the wound itself had been carved by a hand and kept open on purpose was a thing her mind did not want to hold. She asked him who. He told her he did not yet know. But the manipulation was old, older than her, older perhaps than the war itself. Whoever had begun this had begun it before there were vampires and Lycans as the world understood them. The factions had not stumbled into hatred. They had been designed for it. The investigation that followed took them into places neither of them had wanted to revisit. Celine used her access to the older archives, the ones the council kept buried beneath layers of ritual and lock. She brought him fragments of texts that had not been read in centuries, ledgers of births and deaths that had been kept with the care of a scientist rather than a chronicler. Morbius Cross referenced them against the genetic data, and the patterns lined up with a precision that left no room for coincidence. There were names that appeared too often, elders who had outlived their own legends, bloodlines that had been spared in purges that had erased entire rival houses, marriages that had been arranged not for power the way the histories claimed, but for traits, always for traits. Resistance to silver, tolerance for the moon. Each generation a careful experiment, each war a controlled environment, each death a data point in a study no one had known they were part of. And beneath the city, in the oldest references, there were mentions of a place, a facility, a laboratory hidden so deep beneath the streets that even the Lycans, who had spent centuries mapping the tunnels, had never found it. It appeared in fragments only, in the margins of documents that had been deliberately incomplete. A room where the bloodlines were kept pure. A room that should not exist. Celine looked at him across the table when they finally understood what they were reading. The candles between them had burned low. The rain outside had stopped at some point in the night, and neither of them had noticed. She asked him if he was certain he wanted to find that room. He told her, quietly, that he had spent his entire life walking toward rooms exactly like it. The entrance was older than the city above it. Celine led him through a service tunnel beneath an abandoned cathedral, then through a maintenance shaft that should have ended in solid bedrock and instead opened into a stairway carved from black stone. The steps spiraled downward for what felt like hours. The air grew colder as they descended and then strangely warmer. The way the air grows warm near a furnace that has been burning for a long time without anyone tending it. At the bottom of the stairway they found a door. It was iron, banded with sigils Morbius did not recognize but somehow understood, and it was already open. Whoever lived behind it had been expecting them. The chamber beyond was vast. Larger than any single room had a right to be beneath a city, its ceiling lost in shadow far above them. The walls were lined with glass cylinders, hundreds of them, each filled with a slow-turning liquid that glowed faintly red. Inside each cylinder, suspended in the fluid, floated a body. Some were vampires, some were Lycans, some were neither, and worse, some were both, their forms caught halfway between shapes that should never have been able to share a single anatomy. Morbius walked among them slowly. The doctor in him cataloged what he saw with a precision that no amount of horror could disturb. Growth tanks, decanting vats, gene editing arrays of a sophistication that should not have existed in any laboratory above ground, let alone here, hidden beneath centuries of stone. Some of the cylinders held subjects who were clearly dead. Some held subjects whose eyes tracked him as he passed. At the far end of the chamber, on a low dais, 3 figures waited for them. They were vampires, but the word felt inadequate for what stood there. They had been alive long enough that time had stopped registering on them as age and had begun registering instead as a kind of stillness so complete that the air around them seemed to forget how to move. They wore simple robes. They carried no weapons. They did not need any. The power that radiated from them was the quiet power of people who had not been threatened in so many centuries that the very concept of threat had become academic to them. The eldest of them smiled when he saw Morbius. It was not a cruel smile. That was the worst thing about it. It was the smile of a man recognizing after long anticipation a guest he had invited himself. He told Morbius that they had been waiting for him for a very long time. He explained with the patience of a teacher addressing a gifted student what the chamber was and what it had always been. The vampire and Lycan factions, he said, were not nations. They were not even truly species. They were generations, iterations, each one a refinement of the one before, each war a culling, each piece a breeding window, each death a contribution to a body of data that had been accumulating for longer than human civilization had existed. The hatred between the bloodlines was not a tragedy. It was a tool. It kept the populations engaged. It kept the strongest fighting and the weakest dying. It kept the data clean. And the goal of all of it, he said, was perfection. A bloodline that combined the strengths of both predators and the weaknesses of neither. A predator that could walk in sunlight and silver alike. A creature, in short, that could finally inherit the world the elders had spent so many centuries quietly preparing for it. Morbius listened in silence. He understood the language being spoken to him better than the elder knew. He had heard it before. He had spoken it himself, once, in a smaller laboratory over a smaller experiment, when he had been a younger man who believed that any sacrifice was justified if the result was a cure. He had watched that belief turn him into the thing that now stood before these elders, and he had spent every night since trying to make peace with what that belief had caused. The elder told him that he was the missing piece. His biology, born of science rather than bloodline, was the bridge they had been waiting for. With his genetic structure, they could complete the work. The war could end. The perfect predator could be born. All they needed was his cooperation. All they needed was his consent. Celine moved closer to him in the dim light. She did not speak. She did not have to. Morbius looked up at the cylinders around him, at the floating bodies, at the children, because some of them were children, suspended in fluid that had been engineered to keep them alive long enough to be useful. He thought of the patients he had failed in his old life. He thought of the man he had been before the syringe. And he understood with a clarity that felt almost like grief exactly what these elders were asking him to become. The elder offered him the cure that same night. He led Morbius alone to a smaller chamber, separated from the main laboratory by a heavy curtain, and there, on a table prepared with the care of a sacrament, lay a single vial. The fluid inside it was clear. It looked like water. It looked like nothing at all. The elder explained what it was in a voice that was almost gentle. They had perfected it years ago, he said. A serum distilled from the most refined bloodline they had ever produced. Taken once, it would unmake the curse inside Morbius entirely. The hunger would be gone. The thirst would be gone. The terrible strength and the terrible speed and the terrible aloneness would all be gone. He would be a man again. A simple, mortal, ordinary man. He would age. He would tire. He would catch colds in winter and grow tired in summer, and eventually, like every man before him, he would die. The elder said the word die as though it were a gift, and in a way, for Morbius, it was. Morbius stared at the vial for a long time. He thought of his sister, who had died young of the same illness that had driven him into the laboratory in the first place. He thought of the woman he had once been engaged to, who had stopped writing him after the accident, who he had never blamed for stopping. He thought of the children in the wards he had once treated, who had looked at him as though he were a kind of angel before he had become a kind of devil instead. He thought of every meal he had taken with friends in his old life, every glass of wine, every evening on a balcony with a book and the sound of the city below, every small, unremarkable pleasure that the curse had taken from him and replaced with hunger. He thought of how tired he was. The elder watched him with patient eyes. He understood, perhaps better than anyone alive, the precise weight of what he was offering. He had spent centuries calibrating temptations. He knew that the strongest temptation was never wealth or power. It was rest. The strongest temptation was always the chance to put down a burden that had been carried for too long. Morbius reached for the vial. His hand stopped an inch above it. He thought of the cylinders in the chamber beyond the curtain, the floating bodies, the children. He thought of how many of them had been bred and broken and discarded so that this single vial could exist. He thought of how many more would have to be bred and broken and discarded to keep producing them, because a serum like this would not be given freely. It would be a leash. It would be a currency. It would be the thing the elders used to bind him to their work for as long as his cure required maintenance, which would be forever. He thought of Celine, who had spent 600 years fighting a war that had been arranged for her amusement of strangers, and he thought of what it would mean to her if he accepted his rest at the price of her continued cage. He thought, finally, of the man he had been before the syringe, the young doctor who had believed that no cure was worth more than the patient. That principle had been the first thing his curse had asked him to abandon. He had refused every night since to abandon it. He withdrew his hand. He did not speak for a long moment. When he did, his voice was quiet, almost apologetic. the voice of a man declining a kindness rather than refusing a threat. He told the elder that he had spent his entire life learning that some cures cost more than the diseases they treated. He told the elder that he would rather remain a monster who chose than become a man who had been bought. He turned and he walked back through the curtain, and the elder did not stop him. The assault began before dawn. Celine was waiting for him in the main chamber, and she had not been idle while he was behind the curtain. Word had been carried quietly and carefully to certain death dealers she trusted in certain Lycan packs whose alphas she had once spared in battles long forgotten. The fighters who answered her call did not come for an alliance. They came because she had shown them the data Morbius had compiled, and because they had read it, and because they had understood, finally, what the war they had bled for had actually been. The battle in the laboratory was brief and brutal. The elders had grown so accustomed to safety that they had forgotten how to defend themselves. Their guards fell to Celine and her allies. Their machines fell to Morbius, who moved through the chamber with the methodical patience of a doctor closing a wound, shutting down each cylinder, freeing those who could still be freed, granting peace to those who could not. The fires they set behind them rose high enough to be seen from the streets above, though the citizens who saw the glow assumed only that some old building had finally given up its long argument with time. When the chamber collapsed behind them, it took the elders with it. The war did not end that night. Wars rarely do. But something inside it broke that could not be repaired. The data Morbius had gathered was copied and scattered, sent into the hands of vampires and Lycans who had spent their lives believing they were enemies, and who now had to sit with the knowledge that they had been livestock instead. Some refused to believe it. Some killed the messengers. But enough believed it, in enough places, that the old certainties began to thin. Covens began to question their elders. Packs began to question their alphas. The careful machinery of hatred, which had run for so many centuries without anyone tending it, began at last to slow. Morbius left before the new shape of things became clear. He had never belonged to this world, and he knew that staying long enough to be thanked would only complicate what he had come to do. Celine walked with him to the edge of the city, to a place where the buildings thinned and the road bent toward the rising sun. She did not ask him to stay. He did not ask her to come. They understood each other too well for that. He stepped into the light when the dawn finally arrived. The hunger inside him did not burn the way it once had. It simply walked beside him, as it always would. The curse he had refused to put down because the price of putting it down had been too high. He had arrived in this world as an outsider. He left it as a legend, a creature feared by monsters because he had never stopped trying to remain a man,